Is that on a baby bump? How desperate do you have to be to show up like this? The laughter came first, light and sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the courtroom like a glass dropped on marble, and for a brief moment, every head turned not toward the voice, but toward the woman standing alone at the back of the room, her hand resting gently against the soft curve beneath her coat, her expression unreadable, almost distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely, and not in this room filled with polished shoes, tailored suits, and people who had already decided exactly who she was before she even took a step forward. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch. Not when the whispering began, not when a few people leaned closer to each other with knowing smiles, not even when Vanessa Blake tilted her head slightly, lips curved into that effortless, practiced smirk that had replaced Evelyn in every photograph, every event, every memory that used to belong to her. I mean, really, Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with amusement as she glanced around the room, inviting others into the performance, showing up pregnant to a will reading. That's one way to ask for sympathy. A few quiet chuckles followed, careful, restrained, the kind that lived just beneath the surface of politeness, and still, Evelyn said nothing. The courtroom itself felt colder than it should have, the air conditioning set just a little too low, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne lingering in the silence between words, and somewhere near the front, Daniel Carter shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticed by anyone who knew him well, though he didn't turn around, not yet. As if acknowledging her presence would make something real that he had spent months pretending no longer existed. Evelyn took a step forward then, slow and deliberate, her shoes barely making a sound against the glossy floor, and with each step, the murmurs softened, curiosity replacing mockery, because there was something about her stillness, something about the way she carried herself, that didn't quite match the narrative everyone had already written for her. She wasn't dressed to impress, no designer label announcing her return, no dramatic entrance to reclaim attention, just a simple coat, neutral tones, and that quiet, unshakable composure that felt almost out of place in a room designed for power displays and subtle competition. Her fingers brushed lightly against her abdomen again, a small, instinctive motion, protective, grounding, and for the first time, Vanessa's smile faltered just a fraction, too small for most to notice, but enough to shift something in the air, something unspoken. You really don't have to do this, Vanessa added, softer now, but no less pointed, stepping slightly to the side as if to block the path, her heels clicking once against the floor. There's nothing here for you anymore. Evelyn's gaze lifted then, finally meeting hers, calm, steady, not angry, not hurt, just certain, in a way that didn't need explanation, and for a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to pause, suspended between what they thought they knew and something they couldn't quite place. Somewhere near the front, a chair scraped softly as someone adjusted their position, the attorney clearing his throat as he organized the documents laid neatly before him, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, that the atmosphere in the room had already begun to change in ways no one could yet explain. And still, Evelyn said nothing, because she didn't need to. Not yet. The faint scrape of a chair echoed again, sharper this time, and Daniel finally turned, not fully at first, just enough for his profile to come into view, the clean line of his jaw tightening as his eyes landed on Evelyn, and for a fraction of a second something flickered there, something that looked dangerously close to recognition before it was buried beneath the same cool detachment he had perfected over the years, the same look he used in boardrooms and negotiations when something threatened to disrupt his control. You should not be here, he said, his voice low but carrying easily through the quiet room, not raised, not aggressive, just firm, as if stating a simple fact rather than issuing a warning, and yet every word seemed to settle heavily in the space between them. A few heads turned again, drawn by the shift in tone, by the subtle tension that now threaded through the room like an invisible wire pulled too tight. Evelyn stopped a few feet away from the center aisle, close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, lines that had not been there before, lines that spoke of stress, of sleepless nights, of a life that had continued without her but not without consequence, and still, her expression did not change. I received a notice, she replied, her voice calm, even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply stating the reason for her presence as if it required no further justification. Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh but without any warmth, and glanced briefly toward Vanessa, who watched the exchange with a quiet, calculating interest, her earlier amusement now sharpened into something more focused, more deliberate. "That notice was a formality," he said, turning his attention back to Evelyn, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the impatience beneath it. "It does not mean you belong here." The words lingered, heavy with implication, and a ripple of discomfort moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because even those who had already judged Evelyn could sense that something about this moment did not align with the story they had been told. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. She had heard words like these before, in quieter rooms, behind closed doors, delivered with the same measured certainty, the same quiet dismissal that had once made her question everything about herself, her worth, her place in the world, but that was before the silence had become her strength instead of her weakness. Her hand rested again against her abdomen, not as a shield, but as a reminder, and for the first time Daniel's eyes followed the motion, lingering there just a second too long before he looked away, his jaw tightening further as if the sight unsettled him in ways he did not intend to show. "I am not here to belong," Evelyn said softly, the words almost lost beneath the low hum of the air conditioning, yet clear enough to reach him, to settle in the space between them with a quiet finality. "I am here because I was asked to be." There was no accusation in her tone, no hint of defiance, just a simple statement that carried a weight he could not immediately dismiss, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate him. Vanessa stepped forward then, her heels clicking lightly against the floor, placing herself just slightly in front of Daniel as if to reclaim control of the moment, her smile returning, polished and bright, though her eyes held a sharper edge now. "Asked by who?" she said, tilting her head, her voice smooth but pointed, inviting the question that hung unspoken in the room. Evelyn did not answer right away. Instead, she let her gaze drift briefly toward the front, toward the long polished table where the attorney sat with a neat stack of documents, his fingers resting lightly on the top page as if waiting for the exact moment to begin, unaware that the answer to that question was already written in ink that could not be erased. And for the first time since she had stepped into the room, a faint, almost imperceptible shift touched Evelyn's expression. Not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, but something quieter, steadier, something that suggested she was not the one who needed to explain anything at all. And somewhere beneath the tension, beneath the whispers and the judgment and the carefully constructed assumptions, a single truth waited, patient and unyielding, for the moment it would finally be heard. The attorney adjusted his glasses with a measured, almost ritualistic motion, his fingers aligning the edges of the documents in front of him as though precision itself could steady the tension that had begun to ripple through the room, and when he finally looked up, his expression remained professionally neutral, untouched by the subtle undercurrents of judgment and curiosity swirling among the attendees, yet there was a pause, brief but noticeable, as his gaze flickered toward Evelyn, then back to the page, as if confirming something only he understood. "Shall we begin?" he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that immediately softened the whispers, drawing attention forward, away from Vanessa's question that still lingered unanswered in the air. The room responded instinctively, bodies settling into stillness, conversations dissolving into silence, the kind that feels heavier the moment it arrives. Vanessa exhaled softly, a small, controlled breath, and stepped back half a pace, her posture straightening as she reclaimed her composure, though her eyes did not leave Evelyn, watching, measuring, waiting for some crack to appear. Daniel turned forward again as well, his shoulders squared, his focus returning to the attorney with deliberate effort, as if refusing to give the moment any more weight than necessary, yet the tension in his jaw remained, a quiet signal that something had already shifted beyond his control. Evelyn moved then, taking one more step forward before stopping near the aisle, not sitting, not retreating, simply standing. As if the space itself had arranged around her rather than the other way around, her presence no longer tentative but anchored, unyielding in a way that did not demand attention yet held it all the same. The attorney opened the document, the soft sound of paper unfolding echoing faintly in the room, and began to read, his tone steady, deliberate, each word placed with care as though it carried more than just legal meaning. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Halston," he stated, and at the name, a subtle shift passed through the audience, a collective recognition of wealth, of influence, of a man whose absence had gathered them here in the first place, and whose final decisions would determine far more than anyone had yet admitted aloud. Evelyn's gaze remained fixed ahead, but inside, something quieter stirred, not fear, not anticipation, but a memory, faint and distant, like the echo of a conversation held in a different time, in a different space, where the air had smelled less like polished wood and more like antiseptic and fading strength. She did not let it surface fully, not yet, because this moment did not belong to the past, not in a way anyone here could see. To my business associates and extended relations, the attorney continued, reading through the formalities, the expected distributions, names, and figures that moved through the room like passing shadows, drawing nods from some, quiet calculations from others, and the occasional flicker of satisfaction from those who recognized their place within the structure of the estate. Vanessa's expression softened again into a composed smile as she listened, her posture relaxed, confident in the assumption that whatever remained would align with the narrative she had already accepted as truth, while Daniel's attention sharpened, his focus narrowing with each clause, each allocation, as though measuring his standing against the legacy left behind. And still, Evelyn did not move, did not react, her silence no longer passive but deliberate, as if she were listening for something specific, something that had not yet been spoken, something that would not arrive until the room itself was forced to confront it. The attorney turned a page, the sound crisp, definitive, and for a brief second, his voice paused, just long enough for the air to tighten again, for the quiet to deepen into something almost expectant, and though no one spoke, though no one shifted, there was a sense, subtle but undeniable, that whatever came next would not simply continue the story they thought they understood, but change it entirely. To Ms. Vanessa Blake, the attorney continued, his voice steady, almost indifferent to the subtle shift of attention that immediately followed the name. I bequeath the sum of $100,000 as a token of appreciation for her companionship during my later years. The words landed softly, but their meaning rippled outward, drawing a quiet intake of breath from a few corners of the room, the amount respectable, even generous by most standards, yet undeniably smaller than what many had expected for the woman who had so confidently positioned herself at the center of Richard Halston's final chapter. Vanessa's smile held, but it tightened at the edges, just enough to betray the flicker of calculation behind her eyes, her posture remaining poised as she gave a small, acknowledging nod, as though the number meant little to her, as though she had anticipated something far greater but was willing to accept this as a formality, a prelude to something more significant still to come. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward her, a subtle glance, quick and assessing, before returning forward, his expression unchanged but his focus sharpening, the faint crease between his brows deepening as he processed the implications, recalibrating expectations in real time. The attorney did not pause long, turning the page with the same careful precision, his fingers smoothing the paper as he continued, to Mr. Daniel Carter, I leave the sum of $250,000 in recognition of his past business consultations. This time, the reaction was quieter, more contained, but no less present, a low current of surprise threading through the room, because while the amount was larger, it was still far from the kind of legacy many had assumed would be tied to Daniel's name, especially given his proximity to the late Halston in recent years. Daniel's jaw tightened again, more noticeably now, his posture stiffening as he absorbed the figure, his mind already moving, already calculating, already questioning what had been overlooked, or perhaps what had been deliberately withheld. Vanessa turned her head slightly toward him, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes searching his face for confirmation, for reassurance, for any sign that this was not the full picture, that something greater still awaited them both. Neither spoke. The silence between them said enough. And through it all, Evelyn remained exactly where she had been, still, composed, her presence almost quiet enough to be forgotten if not for the subtle gravity that seemed to gather around her, drawing attention back in ways no one fully understood. The attorney's voice continued, moving through smaller allocations, distant relatives, charitable donations, the expected structure of a life meticulously accounted for, each name followed by a figure, each figure reinforcing a pattern that the room had begun to recognize, a pattern that suggested careful distribution, measured intent, and a final sense of order imposed upon everything left behind. Yet beneath that order, something else lingered, something unspoken, something that had not yet been revealed. Evelyn's gaze lowered for just a moment, her hand once again resting lightly against her abdomen, her thumb tracing a small, absent circle as if grounding herself in something deeper than the room, deeper than the moment, and for a brief second, that same distant memory stirred again, clearer this time, a hospital room dimly lit, the quiet rhythm of a monitor, the weight of a conversation that had not felt important then, not in the way it would become. She lifted her eyes again just as the attorney reached the final section of the document, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, not louder, not more dramatic, but heavier, as though the words ahead carried a different kind of significance. He paused, just long enough for the air to tighten once more, for every unspoken assumption in the room to rise to the surface, waiting to be confirmed. And in that pause, something changed. Not in the document, not in the room, but in the space between expectation and reality, where certainty begins to fracture, and truth prepares to step forward, whether anyone is ready for it or not. The attorney inhaled slowly, his fingers resting flat against the final page as though anchoring it in place, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that was no longer procedural, no longer routine, but deliberate, each word placed with a precision that seemed to echo louder than the sentences before it. "And now, the remainder of the estate," he said, and the room responded instantly, a subtle shift forward, a collective tightening of attention, because this was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the unspoken center of it all, the reason assumptions had been made, alliances quietly formed, expectations built in silence long before this reading had begun. Vanessa straightened almost imperceptibly, her shoulders pulling back, her chin lifting just slightly as if preparing to receive something already hers in her mind, while Daniel's gaze sharpened, his focus narrowing with an intensity that bordered on anticipation, his early attention now giving way to a quiet certainty that whatever came next would restore balance, would confirm what he believed had been inevitable all along. The attorney lowered his eyes to the document, and for a brief second, the room held its breath. To the individual who demonstrated unwavering integrity, compassion without expectation, and loyalty in a moment when it was neither required nor rewarded, he read, his tone steady but unmistakably different now, no longer listing, but defining, as though the words themselves were drawing a line between those who had gathered and the one who had not yet been named. A faint crease appeared between Vanessa's brows, subtle, fleeting, as if the phrasing did not align with the narrative she had constructed, while Daniel's expression remained fixed, though the certainty behind it began to thin, just slightly, just enough to let something unfamiliar slip through. Evelyn did not move. Her gaze remained forward, calm, steady, but inside, the memory that had been hovering at the edges of her mind finally stepped fully into place, clear and undeniable, the quiet hospital room, the dim light, the sound of a weakened voice that had spoken not with authority, but with something far rarer, something honest. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not as someone of importance, not as someone to impress, but as someone who had simply stayed when no one else had reason to, who had listened without agenda, who had offered presence without expectation, and in that moment, none of it had felt significant, none of it had seemed like something that would follow her into a room like this, into a moment like this. The attorney turned the page fully, the sound crisp, final, and when he spoke again, the name that followed did not rush, did not stumble, it arrived exactly as written, exactly as intended. I hereby designate Evelyn Carter as the sole heiress to the remainder of my estate. The words did not echo, they did not need to, because the silence that followed was louder than anything that had come before, a complete, absolute stillness that seemed to press in from every direction at once. Vanessa did not move at first, her expression frozen in a shape that no longer fit, her eyes fixed forward as if refusing to process what she had just heard, while Daniel's breath caught almost imperceptibly, his posture stiffening in a way that betrayed the fracture beneath his composure. And at the center of it all, Evelyn remained exactly as she had been, her hand resting lightly against her abdomen, her expression unchanged, because this moment, as overwhelming as it was for everyone else, had already begun for her long before she stepped into this room, long before her name was spoken aloud, long before the truth became something no one could ignore. For a moment, no one spoke, as if the room itself had forgotten how to respond, the weight of the words settling slowly, unevenly, into every corner of the space, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the reactions began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments, a sharp inhale from somewhere near the back, the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted too quickly, the subtle but unmistakable sound of certainty unraveling in real time. That is not possible, Vanessa said, her voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled, but edged with something tighter, something strained, as she stepped forward without realizing she had moved, her eyes fixed on the attorney as though the answer could be undone if she refused to accept it. The attorney did not look up immediately, his gaze still on the document, his fingers pressing lightly against the page as if anchoring the truth in place. The will has been verified and legally executed, he replied calmly, his tone unchanged, untouched by the disruption. There is no ambiguity in its terms. Vanessa's expression shifted again, the practiced composure fracturing further as she turned toward Daniel, searching his face for contradiction, for authority, for something that could restore the version of reality she had been certain of just moments ago. But Daniel did not answer, not right away, because he was no longer looking at the attorney, and he was no longer looking at Vanessa. He was looking at Evelyn. Not with dismissal this time, not with irritation, but with something far more unsettling, something that did not sit easily on his features, recognition mixed with disbelief, as if he were seeing her not as she had been, but as something he had never fully understood. "You knew," he said finally, the words quiet, almost disbelieving, not an accusation, not yet, but a realization forming too late to be useful. Evelyn met his gaze, steady and unflinching, and for the first time, there was a shift in her expression, not triumph, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when something long held in silence is no longer required to remain hidden. "I knew he trusted me," she replied, her voice soft but unmistakably certain, and that answer, simple as it was, seemed to land harder than any explanation could have. Vanessa let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sound brittle, disjointed from the room that had once supported her confidence. "Trusted you," she repeated, her tone sharp, incredulous. "You were not even part of his life. You were nothing." The word hung there, familiar, echoing something that had been said before, in different rooms, in quieter voices, and yet now it sounded different, thinner, as if it no longer carried the same power. Evelyn did not react to it. She did not need to. Instead, her gaze shifted briefly, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel, but toward the document itself, toward the place where her name had been written with intention, with finality, and in that moment, the room seemed to understand something it had missed before, something that had been present from the beginning but overlooked because it did not fit the expected narrative. "There must be some mistake," Vanessa pressed, her voice tightening further, her composure slipping with each word. "He would not leave everything to someone like her." The attorney finally looked up then, his expression composed but firm, his eyes meeting Vanessa's without hesitation. "He did," he said simply, and the finality in those two words closed the space for argument more effectively than anything else could have. Daniel's gaze had not moved. It remained fixed on Evelyn, searching, recalculating, as if trying to trace back every moment he had dismissed, every detail he had overlooked, and finding, too late, that the pattern he thought he understood had never been complete. And Evelyn, standing there in the center of it all, did not step forward, did not claim anything, did not speak again, because she did not need to prove what had already been written, what had already been decided in a moment far removed from this room, a moment no one else had witnessed, and therefore, no one else could challenge. And in that silence, something shifted permanently, not just in the room, but in the balance of everything that had once placed her beneath them, because now, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, she had become the one thing they could not ignore. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, unevenly, like glass under pressure, voices returning in low murmurs that no longer carried confidence but uncertainty, the kind that spreads when something fundamental shifts and no one is quite ready to admit it aloud. Vanessa took a step back this time, not forward, her posture losing its effortless precision as her arms crossed loosely in front of her, not defensive enough to be obvious, but enough to signal the loss of control she could no longer hide, her gaze flickering between the attorney, the document, and finally Evelyn, as if trying to reconcile three separate realities that refused to align. "This does not make sense," she said again, quieter now, but sharper, each word pressed out as though repetition might reshape the outcome. "There has to be context, something missing, some condition." The attorney closed the folder with a soft but definitive sound, his hands resting calmly on top of it, and for the first time, there was a faint shift in his expression, not emotion, but acknowledgement, as though he had anticipated this reaction long before the room arrived at it. "There is context," he replied, his voice even, measured, "and it is included in the supplemental statement Mr. Halston requested be read in full." That word, supplemental, moved through the room with quiet significance, drawing attention back to him, pulling focus away from speculation and toward something far more concrete, something that had not yet been heard. Daniel's posture straightened slightly, his attention sharpening again, this time not with expectation, but with something more cautious, more deliberate, as though he had begun to understand that whatever came next would not restore what had just been undone. Evelyn did not move, but her breath slowed, almost imperceptibly, her fingers resting lightly against the fabric of her coat, as if steadying herself for a moment she had known would arrive, but had not yet fully faced. The attorney opened a separate document, thinner, but handled with the same care, the same deliberate precision, and when he began to read, his tone shifted again, less formal, less detached, carrying the unmistakable imprint of a voice that was no longer his own. "If you are hearing this," he read, "then I am no longer able to say these words myself, which is perhaps for the best, as I have never been particularly skilled at explaining decisions that others find inconvenient." A faint ripple of restrained reaction passed through the room, the unexpected cadence of the statement drawing attention in a way the legal language had not, and for a brief moment, the presence of Richard Halston felt less like a name on paper and more like a man whose voice had found its way back into the room. "I am aware that my final decision will be questioned," the attorney continued, "particularly by those who believe proximity is the same as loyalty, and time spent in my presence equates to understanding me." Vanessa's lips parted slightly, the words landing closer than she expected, while Daniel's expression tightened again, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a truth is directed without needing to name its target. Evelyn's gaze lowered for a fraction of a second, not in discomfort, but in memory, because she could hear it now, not just the words, but the tone behind them, the quiet clarity of a man who had already made peace with being misunderstood. "The woman I have chosen," the attorney read on, "did not ask for my attention, did not seek my approval, and did not remain because there was anything to gain. She remained because she believed I was worth something even when there was no evidence to support that belief." The room stilled again, not with shock this time, but with something deeper, something that required adjustment, because the narrative had shifted once more, not through accusation, not through defense, but through a perspective no one had considered until it was too late to dismiss it. Evelyn lifted her eyes again, and for the first time, there was no distance in them, no quiet separation from the moment, only presence, grounded and unwavering. As if the past and the present had finally aligned into something that no longer needed to be hidden. And in that alignment, the room began to understand that what had just been revealed was not a mistake, not an oversight, but a decision made with intention, with clarity, and with a certainty that no reaction, no objection, and no disbelief could undo. The attorney did not rush the next line, and in that deliberate pacing, the room seemed to lean closer without moving, drawn not by volume but by the quiet gravity of what was still unfolding, because this was no longer about numbers or names, it was about meaning, and meaning, once spoken, could not be taken back. "There was a night," he continued, reading from the statement, "when I was no longer a man of consequence, at least not in the ways the world measures it." The board had already begun to distance themselves, the calls had slowed, and the people who once filled my calendar had suddenly found better places to be. A subtle shift passed through the audience, not discomfort exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes when a truth is familiar enough to feel personal, even if it is not spoken directly to them. Vanessa's gaze lowered briefly, her confidence no longer anchored, her earlier certainty dissolving into something quieter, something less defined, while Daniel remained still, his focus fixed forward, though the tension in his expression had deepened into something more complex, something that could not be easily named. It was not a public fall, the attorney read, there were no headlines, no dramatic exits, just a slow, quiet erosion of relevance, the kind that happens when people decide you are no longer useful. The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but precise, and in that precision, they carried more weight than any spectacle could have. Evelyn's breath remained steady, but her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her coat, not from fear but from memory, because she could see it clearly now, the small hospital room, the dim light filtering through blinds that had not been fully opened, the absence of visitors that had felt louder than any crowd. "She did not know who I was when she stayed," the statement continued, "or if she did not care. She did not ask questions about my estate, my influence, or my past decisions. She asked if I was comfortable, if I needed water, if I wanted the window adjusted." A faint murmur moved through the room, softer this time, not disbelief, but something closer to understanding, though not yet acceptance, because acceptance required letting go of assumptions that had been easier to hold onto. Vanessa shifted her weight, her arms no longer crossed, her hands now loosely at her sides as if she no longer knew where to place them, while Daniel's gaze flickered, just briefly, toward Evelyn again, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with a quiet recalibration, as if the version of her he had constructed no longer held. In that moment, the attorney read on, I was not surrounded by success, or by those who benefited from it. I was simply a man in a room, and she treated me as though that was enough. The words did not need emphasis, they carried their own, and the silence that followed them was no longer tense, but reflective, as if the room itself had been asked a question it did not yet know how to answer. Evelyn lifted her gaze fully now, no longer looking past the moment, no longer holding distance from it, but standing within it, grounded and present, her expression unchanged, yet somehow different, not because she had gained anything, but because what had been unseen was now visible, undeniable in a way that required no defense. So when I considered what remains of my life's work, the statement continued, I chose not based on who stood closest to me when I had everything, but who remained when there was nothing to stand beside. The attorney's voice did not rise, did not fall, it simply delivered the words as they were written, and in doing so, allowed them to settle exactly where they were meant to, not as an argument, not as a justification, but as a conclusion. And in that conclusion, the room shifted again, not with shock this time, but with something quieter, something more permanent, because the truth, once understood, does not need to be repeated, it simply remains. The attorney allowed the silence to settle fully this time, not interrupting it, not softening it, because the words that had just been spoken did not require explanation, and in that stillness, the room began to shift in a way that was no longer outward, no longer about reactions or objections, but inward, quiet, reflective, as if each person present was being asked to reconsider not just what they had heard, but what they had believed before they heard it. Vanessa's gaze remained fixed ahead, but it no longer carried certainty, no longer carried control. Instead there was something else there now, something unsettled, something that did not quite know where to land, her earlier confidence replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any word she could have chosen. She parted her lips once, as if to speak, but no sound followed, and after a brief moment, she closed them again, her posture straight but no longer anchored, as if the ground beneath her had shifted just enough to make balance uncertain. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders lowering just slightly, though the tension in him had not disappeared, it had changed, no longer sharp and defensive, but complex, layered with something that resembled understanding, or perhaps regret, though it was too early to name it fully. His eyes moved again, drawn back to Evelyn, not out of habit, not out of dismissal, but with intention, as if seeing her now required more than a glance, as if it required acknowledgement. Evelyn did not look away. She met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had held from the moment she entered the room, but there was no distance left in it now, no quiet separation, only presence, clear and undeniable, and in that presence, something unspoken passed between them, not forgiveness, not resolution, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change the past, but early enough to reshape what comes next. The attorney closed the supplemental statement carefully, aligning it with the rest of the documents before him, his movements precise, respectful, as if aware that what had just been delivered carried more than legal weight. This concludes the reading, he said, his voice returning to its formal tone, though even that felt different now, less procedural, more final. No one moved immediately. The room remained suspended for a moment longer, held in the quiet aftermath of something that could not be undone. Then, gradually, motion returned, chairs shifting, fabric brushing softly, the low murmur of voices beginning again, but not as before, not with confidence or speculation, but with something more restrained, more cautious, because the narrative that had once seemed clear had been rewritten in a way no one had anticipated. Vanessa turned slightly, her gaze lingering on Evelyn one last time, searching, perhaps, for something that might restore the imbalance she had relied on, but finding nothing she could use, nothing she could challenge, because the truth, once spoken with authority, leaves no space for reinterpretation. Daniel did not move right away. He remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes still on Evelyn, as if there was something he wanted to say, something that had formed in the quiet space between realization and response, but the words did not come, or perhaps they no longer held the same value they once did. Evelyn shifted then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, her hand brushing once more against her abdomen, her posture steady, grounded, as she turned slightly toward the exit, not waiting, not lingering, because she had not come to claim anything, she had come because she had been called, and now that the truth had been spoken, there was nothing left for her to prove. And as she took her first step toward the door, the room did not stop her, did not question her, because something fundamental had already changed, something that could not be reversed, something that no longer required explanation, because in the end, it had never been about what she said, but about what had been written, and what had been written could not be undone. The door was only a few steps away when his voice finally came, not loud, not commanding, but unmistakable, cutting through the low murmur that had begun to fill the room again, and for the first time since the reading ended, it carried something that had not been there before. "Evelyn." She stopped, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had expected this moment, her hand still resting lightly against her abdomen, her posture unchanged, though the air behind her shifted as footsteps followed, measured but no longer confident. Daniel closed the distance between them slowly, each step deliberate, as if unsure how close he was allowed to stand now, as if the space between them had become something he no longer understood how to navigate. "We need to talk," he said, his voice lower. This time, stripped of the authority he once relied on, replaced by something more uncertain, something that did not sit easily on him. Evelyn turned then, just enough to face him, her expression calm, composed, but no longer distant, and in that moment, there was no trace of the woman he used to dismiss, no shadow of the person he believed he had left behind, only someone entirely present, entirely certain in a way that required no validation. "Do we?" she asked, her tone even, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply questioning the necessity of something that once would have been unquestioned. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than resistance would have. He exhaled, running a hand briefly along the side of his jaw, a gesture that revealed more than he intended, because for the first time, there was no clear strategy behind his actions, no calculated response ready to follow. "I did not know," he said finally, the words coming slower now, as if each one had to be considered before it could be spoken, about him, about any of this. Evelyn held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded into something distant, irrelevant, because this was no longer about the audience, no longer about perception, it was about something far more direct, far more personal, and far less forgiving. "You did not ask," she replied softly, and the truth in those 4 words landed with a clarity that no explanation could soften. Daniel's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, because he understood exactly what she meant, not just in this moment, but in all the moments that had come before it, the conversations he had avoided, the questions he had never considered worth asking, the presence he had taken for granted until it was no longer there. Behind them, Vanessa remained near the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the two of them, her earlier confidence gone entirely now, replaced by something quieter, something that did not reach them, could not reach them, because whatever control she had once held had dissolved the moment the truth had been spoken. "That does not change what happened," Daniel continued, his voice tightening slightly, reaching for something more solid, something he could still define. "You left, Evelyn, you walked away." The statement hung there, an attempt to reclaim ground, to reframe the narrative into something he could still recognize. Evelyn's expression did not shift. "No," she said, her voice calm, unwavering, "I stopped staying where I was no longer seen." The distinction settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment, Daniel had no response, no argument that could reshape what had just been said, because it did not accuse, it did not defend, it simply stated something he could not deny without denying what he had already begun to understand. Evelyn turned again then, not waiting for an answer, not expecting one, her steps resuming toward the door with the same steady pace, the same quiet certainty, and this time, he did not follow, because something in her movement made it clear that this was not a conversation he could reclaim, not a moment he could redirect. And as she reached the door, her hand resting briefly against the handle, the room behind her remained filled with people, with voices, with shifting perceptions, but none of it reached her anymore, because she was no longer standing inside their version of the story, she had stepped beyond it, into something they could not redefine, something they could only witness as it moved forward without them. The door opened with a soft, controlled motion, the faint click of the handle barely audible over the low murmur behind her, and for a moment, Evelyn paused at the threshold, not because she hesitated, but because something shifted in the space she was about to leave, something unfinished, something that lingered just long enough to be felt even without turning back. The hallway beyond was quieter, cooler, the air less heavy, as if the world outside that room operated on a different rhythm entirely, one that did not depend on judgment or expectation, but on movement, on continuation. She stepped forward, the door closing behind her with a gentle finality that seemed to separate two versions of reality in a single motion. Inside, the room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Vanessa remained where she stood, her posture no longer composed but rigid, her gaze fixed on the door as if expecting it to open again, as if expecting the moment to reverse itself, to give her back the certainty she had lost. But it did not. Instead, the silence that followed Evelyn's departure settled deeper, heavier, because now there was no presence to challenge, no one to direct their reactions toward, only the echo of what had been revealed and the uncomfortable awareness of how wrong they had all been. Daniel remained near the aisle, his hands at his sides, his gaze lowered now, no longer searching for Evelyn, but fixed somewhere closer, somewhere internal, as if the distance he had to understand was no longer measured in steps, but in moments he could not revisit. Vanessa turned toward him then, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the urgency beneath it. "You are not just going to let her walk out like that," she said, her voice controlled but strained, the sharp edge of disbelief cutting through her words, "after everything, after what she just took from you." Daniel did not respond immediately. He lifted his gaze slowly, not to Vanessa, but toward the front of the room where the attorney still stood, the documents now closed, the matter settled in a way that did not require approval. "She did not take anything from me," he said finally, his voice quiet, but clear, and in that clarity, something shifted again, not in the room, but in him. Vanessa stared at him, the words not aligning with the reaction she expected, her expression tightening further. "She took everything," she insisted, her voice rising just slightly, though not enough to break the restraint of the space that was supposed to be ours. The word lingered, uncertain now, its meaning less defined than it had been before. Daniel's gaze moved then, finally meeting hers, and for the first time, there was no shared understanding there, no alignment, only a distance that had not existed before, subtle but undeniable. "It was never ours," he said, and the truth in that statement did not need emphasis, it settled into the space between them with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. Vanessa's expression faltered, the certainty she had built her position on unraveling piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through absence, through the realization that the foundation itself had never been as solid as she believed. Daniel turned away then, not toward the door, not toward the past that had just walked out of it, but toward something less defined, something he could not yet name, because understanding does not arrive all at once, it comes in fragments. In moments like this, where what once felt certain no longer holds. And beyond that room, down the quiet hallway where the noise could no longer reach her, Evelyn continued forward without looking back, her step steady, her breath even, her hand resting lightly where new life moved quietly beneath her, not as a symbol of what had been lost, but as a reminder of what remained, something untouched by judgment, untouched by expectation, something that did not need to be proven to exist, because it simply did. And in that quiet continuation, there was a different kind of power, one that did not need to be declared, because it had already been recognized where it mattered most. The hallway stretched ahead in quiet symmetry, long and softly lit, the muted beige walls reflecting a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if designed to absorb the weight people carried out of rooms like the one Evelyn had just left, and for the first time since stepping through the door, she slowed, not out of uncertainty, but because the silence here allowed something else to surface, something that had been held beneath composure, beneath restraint, beneath the quiet strength she had carried without interruption. Her hand remained where it had been, resting lightly against her abdomen, her thumb tracing a small, absent motion as her breath settled into a steady rhythm, and in that stillness, the memory returned again, not as a distant echo this time, but as something clear, complete, no longer fragmented by time or distance. She remembered the exact shade of the room, the way the light had filtered through half-closed blinds, casting thin lines across the floor, the faint hum of machines that were no longer urgent, only present, marking time in a way that felt both measured and fragile. Richard Halston had not looked like the man people described in that room. There had been no presence of power, no trace of the authority his name carried outside those walls, only a man who seemed smaller than his reputation, quieter than his legacy, and yet somehow more real than anything she had ever heard about him. She had not gone there for him, not at first. It had been a volunteer shift, a way to fill hours that felt too long, too empty after everything had unraveled in her own life, a space where no one Knew her past, where no one measured her worth by what she had lost. She had not recognized him when she entered, had not connected the name on the chart with the headline she once read without interest, and even if she had, it would not have changed the way she stayed. He had asked her once, his voice quieter than she expected, "Do you know who I am?" And she had paused, not because she was unsure, but because the question itself felt misplaced in that moment, in that room, where identity seemed less important than presence. "You are someone who needs company," she had answered, simple, without weight, without intention beyond the truth of it, and he had looked at her differently after that, not with recognition, not with expectation, but with something softer, something that did not require explanation. She remembered adjusting the blinds when the light shifted too harshly, bringing him water without being asked, sitting in silence when conversation felt unnecessary, and leaving only when she knew he was resting, not because she was required to stay, but because it felt wrong to leave too soon. None of it had felt significant then. None of it had felt like something that would follow her beyond that room, beyond those quiet hours where nothing was exchanged except time and presence. And yet, now, standing in a hallway far removed from that place, she understood what he had seen in those moments, not something extraordinary, not something rare, but something unmeasured, something that had not been shaped by expectation or advantage. She had not stayed for recognition. She had not stayed because it would matter. She had stayed because leaving would have felt like absence, and in that choice, something had been recorded, something that no one else in that courtroom could replicate, no matter how close they had stood when everything else was intact. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the memory settled into place, no longer something she needed to revisit, no longer something that needed to be explained. The door behind her remained closed, the voices inside distant now, irrelevant in a way they had not been before, and as she lifted her gaze and continued down the hallway, her steps steady and unhurried, it became clear that what had happened in that room was not the beginning of her power, but simply the moment it had been recognized, and recognition, unlike perception, does not fade once it has been seen. The exit doors opened to a wash of late afternoon light, soft and golden, spilling across the polished floor in long, quiet streaks that seemed to stretch forward rather than back, and for a moment, Evelyn stepped into it without hesitation, the warmth settling gently against her skin as if the world outside had been waiting, patient and unchanged, for her to arrive. The air carried a different scent here, cleaner, lighter, untouched by the weight of expectation or judgment, and as she moved forward, the sounds of the courthouse faded behind her, replaced by the distant rhythm of the city, steady and indifferent, a reminder that life did not pause for moments of revelation, it simply continued. She descended the steps slowly, one hand resting lightly against the railing, the other still drawn instinctively to her abdomen, her movements careful but not uncertain, grounded in a way that no longer required validation from anyone else. People passed by without recognition, without curiosity, their lives unfolding in parallel without intersecting hers, and in that anonymity, there was a quiet kind of freedom, something she had not fully understood before, something she did not need to protect or explain. Behind her, the doors remained closed, the room she had left already becoming a place of memory, of shifting perceptions and quiet realizations that would linger long after she was gone, but none of it followed her now, none of it held the same weight it once did, because the truth had already done its work, and what remained was simply the aftermath, something others would have to navigate without her presence to anchor it. She reached the bottom step and paused briefly, not because she was unsure of where to go, but because for the first time in a long while, there was no urgency pulling her in any direction, no expectation pressing her forward, only choice, quiet and open, waiting to be made without pressure or consequence. A breeze moved gently through the street, lifting a strand of her hair, brushing against her coat, and she exhaled slowly, the breath steady, unburdened, as if something that had been held too tightly for too long had finally been released without resistance. She thought, briefly, of the room she had just left. Of the faces that had once defined her place, of the voices that had shaped how she was seen, and for a moment, there was no bitterness, no lingering need to correct or confront, only distance, clear and complete, because what had mattered had already been said, and what had needed to be understood had already found its way into the open. She shifted her hand slightly, feeling the quiet, reassuring presence beneath it, a reminder that her story had never truly been confined to the one she had just walked out of, that there was something still unfolding, something untouched by the past, something that did not need to prove its worth to exist fully. A car passed slowly along the curb, the driver glancing briefly in her direction before continuing on. Just another moment in a day filled with countless others, and Evelyn took a step forward, then another, her pace unhurried, her path undefined but certain in a way that did not require direction. She did not look back. Not because there was nothing behind her, but because there was nothing left there that belonged to her anymore. And as she moved into the quiet rhythm of the city, into a future that had not yet been shaped by expectation or assumption, there was a calm, steady understanding that settled within her, something simple, something unspoken, but undeniable in its truth. She had never needed to fight to be seen. She had only needed to become someone who no longer required it. And now, without asking, without proving, without explaining, she was.